We have come to the point where men denies women of their merit on the basis of how there exist different treatment mechanisms. This is the world that under government side we simply oppose, simply for the fact that it brings detrimental harms towards the mobility that the feminist movement would have often had, if not better, under our side. How we're going to come up in the setup here firstly is to provide to you reasons and mechanisms as to how the gender neutral treatment necessarily looks like. Because it looks like parental leaves for both parents. It also means that we're not essentially proving onto quota, but necessarily with merit being the form of like metric that becomes important for women then to gain, for example, jobs, or for example, gaining the particular trust of many societies. But it also means then, for example, equal pay becoming very, very important in the form of the advocacy, right? Which means it isn't just limited to the blind hiring that you necessarily see within the particular motion, but it goes beyond that. Because notice panel, at the point in which we tell you things like focusing on such advocation coming from the feminist movement, it means that there's a shift on that particular concentration, where the policies demanded are ones that are a lot more neutral and ones that actually puts the intersectionality that multiple women necessarily have. Note that then that the feminist movement under our side, or simply what we believe, is that there is a form of mobility, and that's why you have a form of awareness or a form of information these days. But rather, we think it is not one that is meaningful simply because the feminist movement is not trying to create a strategic point then. Secondly, what does opposition's role necessarily look like? Because we think this is important to note. At the point in which you have this necessity of different treatments, it doesn't just mean that maternity leaves or menstruation leaves becomes the utmost importance. Because notice these particular instances are often limited to motherhood, for example. We see this existing within status quo already. For example, in India, we have maternity leaves, but we still see a form of discrimination that still happens within status quo. The strategic framing here then is that this debate is about scale. We'll prove to you how the neutral treatment necessarily tips the particular scale as to why, because the diversity quota often becomes very tokenistic, and the presence of patriarchy is something that we need them to, for example, opt in for you to actually gain a form of mobility, right? Two arguments I'll bring in for today. The first is why this particular movement is a strategic move for the feminist movement to necessarily make, and I'll give you a second argument being very charitable to team opposition, that even if they get changed, why that particular change is necessarily not one that is meaningful. But before that, any clarifications?
Yeah, the policy is prior to payment. So presumably, treatment of women after the fact that you get married can still be terrible.
But that, okay, so I'll explain to that further, but they're not actually, debating against the characterization that I put within. So it is not just limited to, for example, getting hired, but rather the treatments that necessarily women ought to have. I think this is still within the nature of this debate. The first thing to note here is on strategic, why this is strategic for the feminist movement. I think the framing here is that often the world of the society gets colluded with what metric should we actually, for example, weigh this particular woman. We think the comparative here is that simply it's a critical juncture where we need to mobilize this particular, this particular reason, simply because it's insufficient to just have a CEO, being a woman, but rather the treatment that this woman necessarily have is very, very important to note. Why do we have this a lot more better, and why is this a strategic movement for the feminist movement? Three reasons why. The first thing to note is that we need large scale of mass in order for you to be able to have a form of mobility as the feminist movement. And we think at the point in which you have specific treatments on your opposition side, it becomes a lot more harder for you to actually penetrate through multiple bubbles and through multiple discussions that, for example, society has. The difference in the team government then in comparative is that you're able to, for example, beat through this particular barrier simply because this is one that is a lot more neutral. But second to note here is that when you have a lot more people opting in to the nature of, for example, neutral policies and whatsoever, it forms a societal normalization effect, which means the feminist movement is able then to support things like neutrality, and you have forms of, for example, policies that actually go through not only the barrier, but rather becomes a lot more relatable to multiple women. The third thing to note here is that if you don't co-opt men and have men to buy into this particular narrative or buy into this particular form of characterization, it means that you'll have men going against you. So, for example, you have multiple men within status quo being opponents to, for example, the feminist movement. When they say things like the feminist movements are just anti-men or they're just too left-leaning, it means it's easier under team opposition for these particular men to then attack women and to not actually, for example, cooperate with us. How does then our policy changes this, right? Note that it's integral to the thing that I basically provided to you guys just now when it comes to how you're able to get a form of mass. The first thing to note is when we actually advocate for example, neutrality, you have less controversy to exactly what you're creating change. So for example, things like equal pays are things that are very much like, accepted in the collective wide of women, for example. But secondly, you change the way that you advocate for your policies, that not all women are weak, but rather women are good enough and can exist equally with the men, for example, within corporations or within the education scale as well. The weighing here firstly is on the fulfillment of women, right? Because notice at the point in which the metric then shifts to become on merit, it means that it becomes towards the strength of the women. The comparative on the opposition side is that they will have to focus on, for example, the historical struggle that women necessarily have. This takes away the talent that they necessarily have. This debate needs to be a trade-off. So they have to understand that at any point they fight against men actively and they continuously propagate these struggles of women, it only becomes one particular focus only, which means it's hard to tell how men are able to then, for example, cooperate or, for example, become an important, for example, voter bloc within these particular instances. But secondly, we think it's also very empowering for women because this is principally aligned with what the feminist movement has at the top of their particular goal, right? Because they're able to, for example, on scale, cover a variety of women who probably does not opt into motherhood, who actually opts into motherhood, for example, women who, for example, just do not fit in the intersectionality rather, right? This brings me nicely to my second argument, that even if they get change, why is this a change that is not meaningful? Judge, I think it's important to note within framing that the likelihood of necessarily how the two particular analyses that I will tell you becomes very important. Why so? Firstly, we think this tokenistic under opposition is very much like, the mechanism under opposition is tokenistic at best via the necessity of different treatment. Why so? Because firstly, it looks like having diversity quota when you have women as a CEO, but the influence that they have necessarily is very marginal. So for example, casual sexism, mansplaining happens a lot more greater under their side because men would have always had the power to, for example, say, but you're already a CEO because we've given you a quota, for example. The comparative on government side then is that when women get into these particular spaces within their own merit, the framing becomes that this woman then becomes, the acceptance that the woman necessarily gets becomes a lot more important because the shift, for example, of the discourse as to how this woman was put into power, or the realization of, for example, corporate structures, for example, becomes far more great and it just becomes a lot more organic. The second thing to note here is that even at their best, why is this problematic? Firstly, I think women has passed through the same mechanisms anyway, and we don't see any meaningful change. But secondly, things like safe spaces becomes very marginal at the point in which they do not get the appreciation that they should have, ought to have. So for all those reasons, it has to be on gov fix.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. PM tries to tell you that the way in which you get true equality is to argue that social perceptions need to widely change. That's probably realistically true. But the problem here is that an initial gender-neutral lens that you enforce into women refuses or is incapable of addressing the structural inequality that women have been placed under, where if you apply a gender-neutral lens, women by net are still much less employed, much less educated, and get way less opportunities in every single field that men have a stake in, right? What that looks like is that women in current status quo, if you have a lens that removes your discrimination and the narratives of that the patriarchy has placed into your head, are still not as skilled as men because they do not have the same opportunities opportunities that men have because their parents have never bothered to invest as heavily into them, because women still are deprioritized in education and employment because they're seen as less assertive, or they are seen as too assertive when they are trying to be assertive. Women do not get the same degrees of ability to traverse any degree of accountability, and just in net general get worse CVs because of the fact that societal discrimination is as such, right? So I'm unsure as to what mechanism PM tries to provide to us, right? Because she says that, oh, as long as there is some degree of gender neutral lens, suddenly women start having jobs because they get discriminated less. No, that doesn't happen, because what they will then do is look at a women's significantly less nice CV because women have been structurally discriminated, compare that to a man's much nicer CV because they haven't been structurally discriminated and they have in fact been structurally privileged. Henceforth, a man will get selected for the job instead of a woman, which is why there's a necessity for gender affirmative action to kick into the first place. So let's describe what that affirmative action necessarily look like, right? Because I don't think it's just menstrual leave or maternity leave, right? I think it looks like I think when it's implemented, it's likely to be top-down change implemented by government or by internal corporate structures in accordance with demands by feminist groups. So it realistically looks like diversity in certain fields where women are underrepresented, right? Medical fields, tech industries. It looks like diversity in certain departments in which women are oftentimes underrepresented and heavily needed. It looks like HR, it looks like certain accountancy departments. But it also looks like training programs and specific job fairs or upskilling programs provided to women, because we recognize that women oftentimes do not get these educational opportunities from the get-go. It looks like providing more scholarships for women entering into the medical field. It looks like providing more ability for women to get to upskill themselves when they do enter the workplace within the first place, because there might be a recognition that women do not necessarily get the same structural privileges as men to access many different kinds of ability to upskill themselves. At that end, I think this helps women it is necessary to women in a few ways, right? Because number one, it's no longer just saying that, oh, women should be accepted in irregardless of their skill, but it's also saying that when we accept women in, we recognize that they start off at a worse starting point. Hence, we have to recompensate them for the initial disprivileges that we provide them. But second is that I think women feel more comfortable get general levels of larger degrees of galvanization, right? But before that, let's just discuss reception of men, right? Because that's what PM provides us, that, oh, we have to explain how is it that men can understand these changes better or have digest changes. Number one is that if men don't like women in the workplace, they don't just not like women in the workplace because there's affirmative action. They don't like women in the workplace because there's sexist ideas about where women belong, and it's definitely not in the workplace, right? I don't think it's any better if sexist men wouldn't suddenly look at a woman's incredible credentials and decide, oh, you belong in the workplace instead of belonging in another place in which society has placed you. I think realistically they'll still dislike you anyways, which is why in current status quo, women are still underpaid and overworked in every single corporate positions, regardless of where they are, and are still undercredited even if they're like scientists or whatever, because of the fact that men simply do not want to credit women when men simply have these patriarchal ideas. But on the flip side, I think men can be feminists, right? Similarly doing, which what that means is that if we have policies that directly benefit women, if we have policies that tell men that, oh, women your mothers and your sisters have a starting foot into corporations, can get this training from these individuals. I think it allows men to easier buy in, right? Because the degrees of proximity to the benefit. Men no longer feel like, oh, I have to change social perceptions that traditionally benefited me for no particular reason. They are reviewing this on the metric of the benefits that they can possibly get, that their family can possibly also approximately get. I think realistically speaking, they're more likely to back this policy. But let's move on. Why is it that we're more likely to get change on our side? Because galvanization, right? It's the only way. Note here that government is the only way in which support can actually be manifested is where you have a successful marketing policy. And that's a successful marketing policy has to be aimed primarily towards women, because it is your core support base that will actually stick to you at the end of the day, right? Realistically, most men are ambivalent at best or actively hostile towards your policies. What that means is you have to secure the support of women. They say it's principally aligned to recognize that women to some degree have the same skills as a man. True, you have the potential for the same skills of a man, but it doesn't mean that society allows you to express and train that skill to the maximum potential. I'll take you after D. Number one, I think what this policy on our side does, it speaks truth to the lived experiences of women where they are offered less opportunities at education, offer less opportunities at employment. Hence, you have the gender quotas, you have these other training programs to try to fix it, right? I think it more sufficiently targets needs of women on the ground. Number two, I think it looks like more direct self-interest, right? Women more immediately understand that, oh, this policy is one that more immediately benefits me because of the fact that now I get footholds into these certain companies that I otherwise might not get under their status quo, because their reliant policy requires large amounts of men in buying in, or certain targeted amount of men buying in order to change that entire corporate structure within the first place. I think that's the most uncertain level of change in which women are least likely to buy into because they themselves have been oppressed by men for years and decades before. Last thing, I think it's more direct advocacy, right? You have clearer policy goals and clearer ideas of how you want to materialize and crystallize that policy that you sell towards government, sell towards MPs, and it's more direct and easy for individuals to like hands off understand that and advocate for that. When they march on the streets, they say, we want more women in workplaces, here's how you achieve it, instead of like a vague idea of treat women less badly. I'll take the POI now.
It's a bit about scale. Gender quota doesn't work because men would have always been the majority. Best you have 1 woman out of 10 men. How is this meaningful?
Just get more women in, increase the quota. But yeah, increase the quota. But let's move on to certainty, right? I think first, we have better forms of accountability because it's easier to check if people are actually following the quota and allowing women in, right? On their side, they can say, applying this gender neutral policy, we found that women candidates have not managed to qualify to the appropriate level of like competency that we want, or not enough women are coming into this field because we don't have affirmative action to actively push women into this field and motivate women into this field. Henceforth, we decided to not hire as many women as we would have under our side because of that we don't find enough qualified female candidates. It allows this level of plausible deniability towards corporate structures and towards the patriarchy to hire less women and offer women less opportunities. But second, is this it's just easier and possibility, and there's degrees of comfort and better support structures, right? So more women in the workplace, or more certainty of women in the workplace means that there's better support structures that they are created. If you have more women in HR, when you have sexual, like when your boss does inappropriate things to you, you have someone that you can speak to that you feel like will lend an active ear towards you because she might understand more your lived experiences that you come through with, right? This doesn't happen there because they don't target specific industries, target specific sectors in which women particularly care about and have urgent need to have female representation in. But last thing is just galvanization is easier because it happens on a top-down scale and the policy enforcement is more easy to see. Hence, more individuals are more likely to back you because of the fact that they see that your organization is actually doing something rather than a vague notion of what exactly is it that social change occurs under their side. Rest my case.
Right, going back to the book. Slide 20 here.
Fight for women equality is not just what opposition says. It is also about women having access to fight against men in powerful structures, meaningfully, the ability for them to access even these infrastructures to even begin with in the first place. The argument from opposition legitimizes the fact that women, whenever we see women in power, that they are a token, that is tokenistic, and by virtue of quota, that they deserve those spots to begin with. Let's understand context in the first place, because I think a lot of the things that was posited by opposition are already mitigated in the first place. So we have excessive discrimination, things, for example, like discrimination against women is already being outlawed. Things, for example, the discrimination against the overarching clamping down on women are already things that we don't do in society nowadays, albeit not perfect, but it is a stepping stone. Right now, the feminist movement is at a critical juncture where the specific problem that we are faced nowadays, where we understand that men in positions of power do not feel relatable to the current advocacy of feminist movement right now by virtue of having diversity as a form of means of advocacy. Right now, the same explanation by the speaker before me to say that men are ambivalent or men don't care because they do not resonate with this form of advocacy by virtue of them feeling that they are not the cause of patriarchy, that actually their ancestors were the cause of patriarchy, and that I should not have any responsibility to care about women. When we put men and women on an equal playing field in direct competition with each other, and when we see the success stories of women being a CEO of a power powerful 500, Fortune 500 company, those are the success stories that we would rather protect and would rather put on the spotlight and say that women can actually use this as a point of reference to say that women can actually make it by virtue of their merit. That unique argument can never be co-opted by virtue of having diversity quota treatment under that side of the house. I'd like to ask two questions in my speech. Number one, what is the contingency of ops change? And what is the likelihood of getting men in position of power under that side of the house? Why it's unlikely, number one. And number two, even if they can do that, it's not meaningful for women. Secondly, I'm going to ask, how do we get more buy-in on the outside of the house and critical mass? But before that, a few points of contention that stands up. The first thing is that I would like to just point out their solvency mechanism to our PRI, because they say that we can always increase quota. The first thing I would say is that exactly the increase of quota, that does not rebut the Prime Minister's speech of saying that the overarching argument and discussion on how men view women every time when they go into position of power is that these people are tokens. But number two, when you increase quota, presumably because it can create some form of workplace environment that's better for women, but those safe spaces are limited. To what end? When can you penetrate in spaces where it's dominated by men and compete them on an equal level footing? They haven't answered that question yet. But secondly, also, assuming their best case scenario, even if there is, like, for example, in a workplace, there are also men and women, men would always view these women as something that they are not deserving of that spot because they feel that they only get to those spaces by virtue of preferential treatment in status quo. That form of argument cannot be deconstructed if you always go with the feminist movement always go with the advocacy that you need to have diversity treatment quota. Neutrality on the outside is a lot better, because whenever we say that we need better education or we need better wage gap, it blinds to race, religion, gender, and all those things, which means all these good outcomes, for example, decreasing wage gap, or for example, paying men and women the same form of money for the jobs they are doing, can be done on the outside as well, because it's neutral, it's not dependent on your gender. And that's the important thing that they did not realize. So firstly, what is the contingency of ops change? Because I think the discussion on opposition is that these people are vulnerable, and through historical discrimination is what they deserve this diversity, different treatment. The first thing I would say is that this does not work in current context and right now how men operate, because the overarching discussion on how men view women should always be right now is that people view if you have a good merit and if you are like really good enough, then you should be deserving of that position. It is unlikely for men to be to resonate with any form of argument, any form of discussion or arguments of saying that women should be in position of power by virtue of their own gender, because they feel that number one, in worst case scenarios, men feel that they do deserve by virtue of them having a permanent quota in those areas. But number two, we say on the outside of the house is better, because we shift the discussion and shift the narrative right now that women can compete with men, and women do have the same amount of education, the same ability and skill sets to compete with men. And the other side of the house, they overshadow the merits of these women, because the overarching discussion of how we view women is something that's victim-centric, something that these women are vulnerable, as opposed to that this women is actually talented, these women actually deserve to be on that position of power. And this is the tipping point of what we get from government, because in government side of the house, we don't overshadow the merits of women, as opposed to on the other side of the house, where they only forecast that these women deserve this treatment because they have this quota. So the contingency plan under the side of opposition is quite hard, because number one, it's not persuasive to the agents of change, because the agents of change are still men in power, because they don't relate to this form of advocacy. But number two, their contingency of change, it relies heavily a lot on the fact that if they prove it is meaningful enough and that the treatment of women in workplaces would be better, those are the things that they haven't proven yet. Before that, sure.
Communicate to women who are that, for some reason you're expected to live up the same standards that masculine society has imposed upon.
So the thing is, right, is a difference of advocacy and the way we approach specific policies to women. So on the outside of the house, we can also co-opt good policies to women, because good policies are generally good for economy as well. Things, for example, increasing wages so that you can have more people buy into economic frameworks. Those are all policies that can also apply to men and women equally. The difference on your side of the house is that your policies are reactionary towards what happens next. It doesn't take into account whether or not we give equal opportunities to women. It's just equal outcomes afterwards. So the thing is they're only catering on quotas, but the equal opportunities, the way we cater towards men or women can be then better under outside the house? Secondly, how do we get buy-in and critical mass? Both sides agree that the agents of change are men in power, but on the outside of the house, and on the side of opposition, Op agrees that these people are ambivalent and are generally don't care about the struggles of women. How do we tip the scales on the outside the house? We feel there are two reasons. First is that we don't attack the identity of that man. Hence, they don't feel that they're in direct opposition whenever the feminist movement is carrying out their advocacy. They are more likely to feel direct opposition on their side of the house because men feels that this is an attack against them as a personal identity. We on the outside of the house under their side of the house, men don't relate with their advocacy because they just don't care about whether or not women do deserve a spot in that company. So proud to propose.
Everyone, my name is Salleh. I'll take my POI in the chat. I'm from you guys at the 5th minute. I'll just set up my timer, then I'll start my speech. Start my speech in 3, 2, 1. This team sells you the lie that society is closer to equality between the two genders. I want you to tell that to the class action lawsuits against Blizzard for sexist and rapist assault culture in 2018. And these are practical harms that happen to human beings that we think they have a human right to be able to advocate against. Because I agree with Taki. People, for some odd reason, panel, think that the feminist movement, when they advocate for affirmative action, are messaging it as women are entitled to this, that women are better than men. If you look at things objectively, in terms of the majority of protests by the feminist movement, in terms of the actual policy pushes and lobbying for this, are for equality and against mistreatment, rather than some sort of benefit that they want, not the supremacy that they're talking about. But it is quite odd that this is something that's very popular. And I think this is for two reasons. The first is that it's because men just simply misunderstand feminism. And because of this, the solution cannot be to stop talking about your struggles and pretending that it's equal. It has to be to highlight more of your struggles within the hiring practices, more of your struggles after the fact that you have been hired that are tied towards your things like social mobility. But second, I think this is a whole other aspect of the debate and the narrative that this team doesn't really engage with. Let's talk about the second thing. Why is implementation practical? So governments will implement affirmative action policies for three reasons. One is that women can and will protest. Politicians care for optics, and if you have large protests in your parliament, then are likely to listen to you. There are also women politicians like AOC that support this. But second, women can and oftentimes lobby for these changes because they feel underrepresented. Because when they talk to the man in HR about how they felt as if their coworker was hitting on them inappropriately, they say that it's just a joke. Third, voter demographics to capitalize on minority demographics means that there are political parties that want to focus on this. Next thing I'm going to do is give two additional responses. One is on the reception of men to our policy. Look, men are more receptive now because of the efforts of feminist movements in the past in raising awareness for the past few decades. Firstly, men are more educated because throughout the 2000s and 2010s, the third wave of feminism meant that women constantly talked about the structural inequalities that men have observed to be real presently. Second, that there have been more interactions between men and women due to increased contact from affirmative action policies that make it easier to bridge the empathetic gap that exists because of different lived experiences that lead to men listening and fighting against their biases more. But thirdly, that women exist in men's lives, and you had working mothers that talked about their struggles within not getting promotions. You have sisters and wives that talk about their struggles within getting hired. So then you're probably asking yourself the question, if men can be receptive, why then isn't treatment equal? The answer is because it's not equal full because your brain as a human being makes you interact differently to different contexts. So when you're a man and you're listening to a woman talk about her struggles, you are more likely to be receptive because you view them as more human. But when your biases make it so that you act in a specific way and you're getting called for it, that it's neutral and that it is neutral and is affirmed by their feminist movement, then you're more likely going to be defensive when it is implied that you might be the sexist coworker, you might be the person that's discriminating in hiring practices, is when you get defensive and enact discrimination. Second thing, I think that you need to weigh the impacts of both teams with this understanding. I think we just get more certain outcomes because hiring is significantly more certain and he avoids this aspect of bias within men. Because regardless of the bias, we get more women in management that can promote more women when it's suitable, more women in HR that are more empathetic towards the issues of women and platform this as something that is legitimate. Secondly, here, I think accountability is just more certain. Not having women in your organization isn't an option because there are quotas. Even if your workplace is not sexist, this is still a harm under that side. Because having majority men fields just makes your culture less empathetic or aware of women's struggles simply because you don't talk about this and don't have enough contact with women under that side of the house, leading to these workplaces getting worse. And not the burden of proof under that side, by the way, is to prove that all industries like finance, like game development, or industries that are predominantly dominated by men that require affirmative action policies here are somehow equal within the representation of women to avoid this harm. Before I talk about the argument for why you actually lose galvanization for women, therefore making their argument not important, I'll take that POI.
So treat a worker better. It's not contingent upon whether or not the person is a man or woman. Presumably on the outside of the house, you also need to engage with the fact
Yes,
that there's-
it does depend on it because if you have pre-existing biases, because we live in a patriarchy and you are more likely to believe yourself to be equal to women and yourself to be someone that is good, then when you do have like these biases leak out, you're not going to like be accountable to it. Okay, argument. When the feminist movement themselves acknowledges gender neutral policies, then I think sexist structures are more prone to avoiding accountability and progress. Note, if their claim is that men are not receptive to AA policies, it requires you to assume that these are inherent cognitive biases in men to firstly, not view themselves as complicit in oppressing women, but secondly, view themselves as and women as equal in opportunity and treatment, therefore views AA as unfair. If you believe this, then regardless of feminist movement's incentives to cater the messaging to be careful, these same men in influential positions, higher echelons of power, your men that vote on policies are more likely going to perceive your movement as conceding to their rhetoric that we do live in an egalitarian society, that your policies are not needed and fair to society that treats women equally. Firstly, is that your movement structurally develops into one that becomes risk averse in the communication of their policies, but also what policies they adopt and champion, which means counter narratives by women that come from communities that genuinely are disprivileged by the patriarchy via prevention of pursuing education, therefore have less initial competencies. Your movement silences these people and deprioritizes them in favor of preserving the stance that discrimination is social rather than structural. Second, that this category of women are the majority. Even if it's not factual, Judge, you need to believe that women generally believe this, therefore, is something that's important because the structural harms of the patriarchy that leads to the collective belief that society is not gender neutral is something that's prominent. Gut check this. When's the last time you met a non-feminist movement? But second, is that women do collectively experience nuanced microaggressions that cognitively lead you to believing that more likely than not, when you are mistreated, it is because that man is sexist, even if in reality that person isn't really sexist, which means the majority of feminists within feminist movements are cognitively programmed to believe this because your brain wires the negative experiences that you have to be representative of future interactions that you have. When you platform these discussions, when you actually check whether or not these are structures that are harmful, is when you're more likely to change these structures. For these reasons, we won.
each time this opposition team pushes the characterization of society being actively sexist, this hurts them. Because it means that they had to prove why simply putting more women into those companies would effectively create the contact theory that will make them less sexist. They had to prove why a narrative that tells people that you should have more women simply because they face some historical sexism will change those men. If these men were actively as sexist as they claim, they would not believe those narratives. They would not be significantly persuaded that this is something I should do. They would not understand why I should be educated on what women face per their characterization of them being sexist. What do we think was the more reasonable characterization of the debate that they've continuously misread and not actually responded to? We explained that the worst excesses of sexism are mitigated because they are demonized, few and far between, or happen on both sides. So what we are able to do is, in case majority of men think that things are already fine, because even if there's small microaggressions, they understand why huge amounts of discrimination is bad. They don't understand why small amounts of microaggression are bad, which is why the thing that needs to make people who feel like they don't understand it's bad is if we give a more universal narrative that people want to buy into, which is that equality is good. 3 issues in this speech. First, on correcting historical sexism. Second, on political strategy. And third, on the sustainability of change. First issue on correcting historical sexism. They give 2 claims. Number 1, that we need special treatment to correct for nuanced historical struggles. The first thing we respond to is that preemptively, our case is correcting for all parts of the process. So it's not just within hiring, but also once you're already in the company, part of the interviews as well. So even if there's some historical struggle there, at all parts, it becomes easier for women. So during the interview, we have clearer processes that don't lead to people being discriminated. Or when it comes towards submitting your resumes, we don't look at your face to see whether you're a woman or not. This addresses their extremely convenient characterization that they dropped from second, that parents don't educate and train their daughters. But the problem here is that it becomes easier for women to be incentivized to join the workforce on our side because they believe they have equal consideration. They believe that you have a chance at making it, rather than on theirs because they have policy that's very few and far between, because we prove why it's ineffective in getting those quotas in place. So even if a man has a better CV than women because of a historical, more privileged starting point, this is a relatively short-term harm that we think we can overcome. So we concede there'll probably be some race they have to compete in at first. But now when we see that women are more easily able to compete with men, there's more incentives to train them to become working people rather than housewives. We get more incentives to get them to enter the workforce in the first place. So those historical starting points are easier to correct for under our side rather than on theirs, where this only applies to a few. The second thing they claim in POI is, how do you communicate to oppressed women that they have to compete with men? The first thing is that in the long term, we need to compete on the same grounds as men eventually anyway. We do it better because at the very least, we give them the equal consideration. On theirs, if they don't want to compete with men at all, they have to defend a permanent system of quotas, a permanent system of special treatment. Very unclear from this team when that system goes away. When is it finally okay for us to not have quotas? When is it okay that contact theory has worked, we can have equal treatment then? Never proven, it's too late to mechanize it in WIP. But secondly, we explain that women are less important of a critical stakeholder in terms of the voting in this debate. And the reason for this is because they will support the feminist movement on either side, because the feminist movement is the only body championing their rights. So all of DLO's mechanization of protesting, lobbying, AOC are things that will exist on our side, because women suddenly just will not just stop supporting feminist movement, because even if it's not as good for them, it's the one thing that they have, which means they will still side with whatever the feminist movement chooses to do, which is why it means they'll still be effective on our side. The impact is this. Yes, they prove there is historical sexism. They have to prove why the solution to that sexism is this policy, which we explain is ineffective. Which leads to the second thing. Why is this very insufficient in getting change? Stepping outside the nebulous debate land, we prove why their side has an ineffective and failed political strategy. 1, it directly antagonizes men, because one more reserved spot for a woman means one more spot taken away from someone who have otherwise gone to a man. So men feel like this quota is directly threatening to them, as opposed to our narrative that says it is good for men if you have this equality when you get a woman as well, because that woman has proved her meritocracy, proved her worth, that she will be productive to the company, which is why it's easier to convince men on our comparative. Number 2, it legitimizes toxic masculine narratives. When Andrew Tate say women have it easier because they are able to have these things preserved for them. On their side, they feed into those narratives. Rather than on our side, we push the narrative that women can compete on the same grounds as men. It becomes more empowering, that their true talents can shine. That you should have women in the company, not because they were historically oppressed, but because they have equal talents and equal skills. Finally, we explain it's very hard to educate men, because how are you able to acutely communicate the microaggressions that women face to a man who's never experienced it before and expect them to agree to the same thing? Never proven by this team. Their only response is some men might be feminists because they understand the struggles of the sisters and mothers. Number one, depends on them being empathetic, which is in tension with your entire characterization of men being sexist. Number two, just gut check whether this is persuasive. Men still catcall or commit assault even if they know that their sisters go through this. I would note that our strategy of neutral treatment has a demonstrated record of success that this team doesn't respond to. When the feminist movement advocated for paternal leave instead of just maternity leave, when we recognize this isn't a right that should be afforded only to mothers but also to fathers, there was far more capital and success. Here's the weighing. Even if women don't directly benefit from paternity leave, the fact that you're also fighting for men's leave creates intersectionality and bridge the empathy gap to create allyship in the first place. Yeah.
The response is society is generally more equal, so you cannot pass affirmative action. But your case is you'll get reforms and prepare for treatment in work, and somehow men are accepted. How are men really?
No, so we win in both cases because we can't unilaterally say which society which applies to. If society is sexist, we explain why your policies will not work even if you put it in their face, because they don't believe that women actually suffer from these things, or they feel like they have no incentive to cater to that. If society is already one that's moderate, we explain why it is limits that none of their problems actually exist about them being so oppressed that we need specific tailored policies. So we should err on the side of caution on our side, because it means that we get to have the long-term narrative of women equally capable as men, rather than only succeeding because that they were given special privileges, which means we also protect them. We also explain this as an easier cultural narrative because meritocracy and fairness is seen as a universal virtue, and we wait that buy-in is the precondition to any benefit. The other side can say, oh, all these problems, you have to prove why people buy into those policies, and we prove from PM to little response why men are critical voter bases, because they're the ones that we can least co-opt. They're the swing voters in this debate, right? We don't know whether they're going to vote for or against this, so we should get that women will vote anyway. Third issue on sustainability of change, no response. They concede from LO this is going to be a primarily top-down change. Their policies will be inherently paternalistic. So what this means is that people will still be sexist towards women on their side, even if they are in the company. On our side, we organically change the incentives of men, because we change their narrative that they're going to be sexist. We tell them that women can in fact be as good, which is why they will buy our side instead. Very proud of folks.
My name is Andrea. Please give me like 1 minute to check my notes. Your answer the 5th minute. I'll call you if I need any earlier. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The government side falls when they fail to realize that in order for them to achieve all the outcomes that they claim that they can achieve is is entirely contingent on the fact that you can change societal perceptions, that men is willing to acknowledge women's like merits or their achievements. But the problem is that when you do not have more women telling men of their struggles, for men to acknowledge his struggles exist in the first place, these kind of societal perceptions can never be changed. What I'm going to do today's debate, I'm going to give you 3 clashes and why we win over today's debate. The first one, on the advocacy of these policies, who best achieve this kind of advocacy, right? Government wants to say that one societal perception under their side of the house can be dismantled, the more that because men can now view women inside a more neutral lens where like women can have achievements, right? I think Cheng already points out to you that these kind of structural barriers that exist within these kind of companies and within the patriarchy society itself carries over to a societal perception itself. That even if that you have all of these gender neutral treatment that caters towards men as well, doesn't mean that men would suddenly believe that women deserves equal pay, that men will suddenly think that, oh, women doesn't belong in the household but now belong in the work field, right? I'm unsure as to why they are able to get all of these changes in the first place and get a massive change enough for them to restructure the whole company, to restructure the whole workforce itself, right? I don't understand how is that likely to happen. They don't tell you how. 2, the policies they say are better for both men and women. That's why like everyone will perceive it to be better, right? But I think that's untrue because 1, the most vulnerable usually gets locked out. Who are the most vulnerable with today's debate? Women who do not get the opportunities to get higher in the first place or to climb up the ladders to access these kind of benefits in the first place. That notes then that when you do not even open up the accessibility for them to tap into these opportunities, even if all the benefits are so good that they want to claim, who is benefiting are not the women who are the most vulnerable at the end of today's debate. What is likely to happen under the other side of the house is that you further worsen the situation of the most vulnerable, right? If we concedes that you can never see the face that when you're reviewing CVs or whatsoever, right? And that they say that short-term harm is can be mitigated because there's more training than for women who are already in the workplace. This doesn't exist to women who are not even in the workplace to begin with, the most vulnerable that can't tap into these kind of accessibility opportunities in the first place. But secondly, also, these kind of training or things that they want to achieve aren't likely to be enforced. They don't give us incentive as to why it's likely to be enforced. These companies can just say that, hey, we have already made these kind of treatments in the first place, we already made the policy. Why are you asking for more? Why do you want us to, there's no incentive for them to enforce it in the first place to make sure that all the women who are the most vulnerable can tap into this accessibility. What is likely to happen under their side of the house is that women with the most achievements are only the ones that tap into all of these benefits. But it's unlikely so when you do not even give them the opportunity to excel themselves within to get self achievements, right? They say. So yeah, I think this is why it happens that it falls under their side of the house where you don't protect the most vulnerable. Under our side of the house, what is likely to happen is that 1, you need to note that in order to get the advocacy for these policies, you need critical mass to push for these policies, right? Critical mass can only be garnered due to a certainty of success that the feminist movement is seen to or perceived to have. This is only likely to happen when you are perceived to protect the most vulnerable women and to lead to more women who are the most vulnerable to opt into you or believe in you and to sustain the movement itself. I'll talk about sustainability of the movement later. But 2, also, more women in power means that there are more women who understand the systemic barriers, meaning that they are more empathetic than men in power who have never been through the same struggles that they have been through. This is why sexist policies or the lack of sexual harassment policies still exist, because men can never understand the struggle of or the need to have these policies in the first place. The only time when you garner change to make sure these policies are in place is when you have women in power that 1, pushes for these policies to be in place because they understand the struggles and the necessity for them to do so, but B, to further enforce it because they see that these are not enforced and they are more likely to speak out, to have these kind of men accountable to change the company process under our side of the house. It's only under our side when you get this that it's an exclusive benefit under our side. Take a view.
So if your side says we only help high achieving women, means you must put low achieving women in power. If men who are uneducated on the struggles of women and who are sensitive, how will they respond to you putting these women into those positions who otherwise wouldn't be there?
Okay, great. Let's move on then to my second clash, onto galvanization of women in this kind of feminist movement itself. I'll tackle your PI within this kind of clash itself. I think 1, what they say is that 1, it's insufficient for more women to be in positions of power because they do not access a better. This leads to lack of access or better treatment for women. I think that's untrue. The problem is caused because of the lack of women in position of power to change treatment in the first place. Under your side of the house, you will have lesser women in power because of structural barriers that Chamber posits to you already. That doesn't mean that you're going to have more women to get into these powers of these position of powers itself, right? Just because even if women have already a lot of achievements themselves to access this, doesn't mean that the company itself, or doesn't mean that men themselves who are in position of power to choose this woman will likely give women these kind of opportunities than choosing men who all have the same achievement itself. itself, right? No more points itself. I'm not taking anything out now. But what I'm trying to say is that the fact is that when you have women and men who has the same achievement, it's likely so that men, because of cognitive bias, because of in-group, out-group theory, Cheng and Salleh positive to you, it's likely that they'll choose men over putting these women in power in the first place. Under your side of house, you don't even get women in power at all. So you don't get any kind of changes that you want to perceive, right? I think too, they say co-opting men is important. If not, they go against you, right? I think one, just because men are not threatened doesn't mean that they suddenly now understand the struggles of women or decide to not use their advantages against women itself. I don't think you mechanize enough to us. Why is it likely that men who are already in, who are so usual to being in position of power, wouldn't like consciously or unconsciously commit all of these things towards women, or to show that they are in powers, or like to show that women should be more submissive, or to cater to the kind of conservative narrative that men already has? I don't think you tell us why. But I think that we are flipping it, because empathy for men is more likely to happen under our side of the house. It's more likely that we're going to get true empathy under our side of the house because of the fact that they are more proximate to women who are now within the same playing field as them, who are now ready to feel voice out their struggles. They are now ready to hear or not hear, or like they are more forced or coerced into hearing more women to speak up about their struggles when they're in the same playing field, right? What is likely to happen under their side of house is that women are more likely to splinter due to the different perspective in hiring process. Some believe that even with blind hiring, there are systemic barriers that reflect on their CV, on their skills, the lack of skills training, CV opportunities, etc. This largely impacts them when they can never get hired, which affects their livelihood. And this is a firmer stance on the other side of the house that leads to a high likelihood of fracturization within the feminist movement itself. That means that they can't galvanize the feminist movement to come together and push for more policies or to push for more progression. What's likely to happen under our side of the house is that one, this kind of feminist movement can only function when women opt in, right? One is that you have to know that feminist movement is a community where women would get more support from other women because they understand the struggles more. When you don't even have this, because women will now get all of these benefits, or the most successful woman gets all of these benefits, and say that, hey, we get these benefits, that's why we're unlikely to want to listen to you. You don't get all these support under your side of house. Under their side of house, women don't feel truly represented or empowered by this feminist movement, because those who are so systemically disadvantaged has a lead likelihood of getting hired. This means that one, they either can raise concerns, but they are now silent because other women benefit will just want to not opt in, but two, they opt out. This means that you don't turn out to your protest or to donate. The impact is that there's lesser safe space to address kind of concern. There's more fracturization that slows the progress of the movement to achieve any outcome, right? And there's outside house that's common ground where all these women can come together to want the accessibility of being hired, and that's why we have never been prouder to oppose.
Support Utimara women on team. Oh, it's so cold in this room. Damn. I don't remember this room being so cold. Y'all really compensated for the net north lack of aircon. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's examine government's main criticisms of our case, right? They have like 4. Number 1 is that women are more motivated under their end. We don't motivate women enough. Number 2, there's long-termism. Number 3, that people in feminism won't opt out because it's the only thing that they have. Number 4 is tokenism. Let's address the first one, that women are more motivated to be pushed into a position of leadership, the point in which you treat them like men. So here's the thing. This debate isn't a problem of motivation, because presumably women want to be in high positions of power and change society. That's an innately human drive. That's something that already exists under both sides, irregardless, right? I think the difference is who gives these women the best abilities to actually act on this motivation and actually realize that potential, right? The problem here is that they say that equal treatment allows individuals to recompensate for historical backlog, that historical backlog of discrimination and the inability for them to realize to their degree the fullest potential. But problem here is that, of course, women are not going to immediately overnight get that degree of recompensation, and therefore affirmative action policies are necessary under our end, right? So if you're not, since we're not debating on motivation, I don't really quite understand why that motivation thing comes into play. Maybe Sarah will explain it. I think she will, right? Okay, second, long-termism. Women have to compete with men eventually, so therefore it's unfair that affirmative action policies last in perpetuity. Sure, maybe it's unfair for in perpetuum for that to do it, but I think in this debate, the only burden the opposition has to argue that the strategy is most viable right now and is something that progresses feminism movement to the maximum extent. I don't think we need to take on the long-termism argument because they don't impact. Why is it that the long-termism argument particularly matters at the end of the day, right? Why is it that men would treat this as it's going to exist in perpetuum? I don't know why the feminism wants to stick with this forever also. Never our burden. Third, is the one thing that feminist movement is the only thing that women have, so therefore they'll support it always. Not true, because they are patriarchal women and they are women who are unpolitically motivated. That's why on their end, they focus so much on galvanizing women, into ensuring that women get to like step into feminism and embrace feminism also. So therefore, presumably it's important to galvanize women, henceforth it's important for goals of galvanization to be clear. Henceforth, you should buy into our side because we provide to you clearer and easier to understand mechanizations on the why exactly is it that women want more direct policies that benefit them and can advocate better for direct policies that immediately impact them, right? I'm unsure as to why is it that they win on the idea of galvanization. Last thing, tokenism. Okay, maybe tokenism is bad when men look at you and be like, oh, you don't deserve to be here. But isn't it arguably worse when there is no women around for these men to point fingers at? Because like accessing this job is something that is uncertain under their end, right? Because what happens here is there's no certainty that they get hired because they just say, we reviewed your CV, it's worse than the man's, so therefore we took the man for the job instead of let's give the benefit of doubt to structurally oppressed women and hire her in and give her training policies to recompensate. But second, it's just that they might not realize that they are biased from the get-go, right? So that's the entire dialogue push, right? Men internalize these narratives about how society has structured women, has placed women in and don't realize that they are biased. This leads into two different argumentations or the two sets of societies that want to argue about antagonism, right? They say in sexist societies that men want you to be less antagonistic. It's just like antagonism is going to happen under both ends because of the fact that men will have to recognize that they structurally oppress women under both ends, meaning that you have to ask men to be accountable, that they have hired less women, that they have underpaid women, that there is pig tax and all these other corporate structural barriers that they have placed onto women and try to recompensate for that. The entire case is reliant on this idea that men accept that they are socially disabled women to a very large extent. I'm not sure why conservative societies will go for that better. But number two is that they say in moderate societies, these gender-neutral policies are more appealing to both sides. First, if it's gender-neutral and benefits everyone, it's likely to be the things that will be adopted nonetheless. That's very simple to get. But second is that with societies where microaggressions are the main thing that you fight against, you cannot simply argue that, oh, we should just treat everyone the same because microaggressions are treated as the status quo and the same as everyone else, right? Individuals don't conceptualize microaggressions as microaggressions, they just conceptualize it as like, I don't know, workplace office talk that sometimes women are oversensitive to. But last thing, things such as parental leave, equal play are post-hiring, right? They don't fiat the world to be meritocratic at the get-go. And the point in which people aren't meritocratic, and there is pay gap, there is all of these other things that already burden women. It's important for us to try to recompensate for that and provide the types of programs talked about now. And so, yeah.
Women are highly motivated. We see this in our mothers, we see this in women all around. They're just essentially really, really motivated. So it's very uncharitable for Op Reply to essentially say that when we do not have quota, we do not have women who are motivated to get some income. We think this is very uncharitable panel. This team is extremely convenient, and it's clearest when their opposition replies wanted to co-opt every single thing that we told you was a benefit under our side. Two things I want to do in my reply. The first thing is give you a call out as to the inconsistency that they themselves put onto themselves. But secondly, I'll give you particular issues and weigh ourselves above them. The first of in call out is that they necessarily do not prove how women can climb up the social ladder. This is important for three reasons. Because firstly, opposition misreps us by saying that vulnerable women would have always been affected, but they don't tell us how they create change when these women are in these particular corporate structures that we provided to you becomes very, very harmful. But secondly, we don't necessarily understand, for example, the leap as to how you're able to, for example, have things being good for you. So let's say, yes, you have a boss within these particular corporate structures, but how is this particular boss able to create that particular change if you don't actually change the mindset of men anyway? But thirdly, it means that at best, they have women who probably are just in because they're just based on their gender. So you probably do not have women who are actually qualified, which then becomes an attack for men to go against you, right? We think it's important for them to understand four important call-ups again, because number one, we think the feminist feminist movement has a very much limited capacity. The feminist movement cannot just always increase quota within multiple departments as to what the opposition tries to draw you. But secondly, the narrative or the optics that the movement then would receive from continuously asking for these particular quotas, when not actually receiving any forms of meaningful change for women, then becomes a tipping point as to how the men will then attack you necessarily. But secondly, the aggression that women deal with after their employment is very, very much important, because at any point the feminist movement does not want to create change for this woman who then gets employed. It becomes a further problem for men to just always, for example, point the finger and say, for example, we've given you a spot and you've already received it, right? We think then, under our side, the comparative is easier because merit becomes easy for you to penetrate because it doesn't directly, for example, take a position for a man that they needed to prove as to how women then can, for example, try to neutralize those particular instances. Two particular wings, right? The first is how we get better critical mass and buy-in, which is a very important thing within this debate. And secondly, on intersectionality, where we have more women actually opting into our case. The first thing on critical mass, I think this is important because it's the only way for teams to be ordered to get like meaningful policies, right? We think if society is then very much sexist, which by the way was the characterization the opposition themselves wanted to do, then you have zero change even under their side. But we've provided to you, which is very much the likely characterization, that the society would probably be somewhere in the middle, which is actually somewhere very neutral, right? Know that opposition's characterization then means that your struggle as a woman at any point you point this out, it then becomes a tipping point. But they don't provide that particular leaf as to how you're able to get that. We think the comparative that we provided under government is much more better because at the point in which men and women are seen as equal, there isn't, for example, a literal attack because you are just competing as a human being and not necessarily for your gender, right? We think then the under mechanization that they said, for example, that there are pre-existing biases and, for example, the patriarchy would change under their side is very much convenient because they don't prove this necessarily. How, for example, just by saying that your mothers, for example, claim for not getting a position, that giving quota makes men feel secure. They don't provide reasons as to why, for example, there is incentive for men within workspaces to be able to listen to their employee under them. Because not panel, the majority of like workers in the corporation would have still been men that they do not want to engage with. Secondly, is on intersectionality. Because notice here then that the scale of women being able to relate to the policies under our side is far greater because of the scale. Because firstly, note that the policies under their side are very much limited because they can't just say they're going to increase quota because women would have always felt discriminated for their strength and talent not being the metric of the particular instances. But secondly, in terms of the corporate structural mechanisms, it's very uncharitable because they don't provide reasons as to, for example, how the contact theory works. Because we do not have just a CEO that is a woman and somehow now we have all sorts of policies that benefits women entirely. I think it's very clear. It has to be team government. Thanks.
Thank you so much for taking
Thank you.